Hello everybody, Network Whiz Kid here. In this video we're going to start to take a look at the Duo Network Gateway, or DNG for short. This particular video is going to focus on an overview of the DNG and focus on the deployment and planning for a deployment if you are looking at rolling out the DNG within your environment. This is number one of a series of videos that I will do because there is quite a few things to kind of take into consideration. So I wanted to split these videos in relation to the DNG up into a series of videos so that they're easy for you to consume and you can focus on the particular areas that you may be interested in deploying. But before we get into that, just a quick message from one of our sponsors today. Have you ever wondered how to protect your emails in the cloud? Well, look no further because there's Hornet Security, a leading cloud email security provider with over 15 years in the game. Hornet Security now protect the emails of over 50,000 organizations throughout the world, big and small, with a number of services ranging from email encryption to advanced threat protection, spam and malware protection, to the full 365 total protection package for Microsoft 365. Each service is designed to be as seamless as possible, increasing the security posture of your business and simplifying your IT security management. For more information, check out hornetsecurity.com and start your free trial today. So the very first thing we need to ask ourselves, and this is probably more of a question for those that have never really been exposed to the DNG or are really just starting to look at the DNG, and that is, what is the DNG, or Duo Network Gateway? And essentially all it is a solution, if you like. It's similar to a reverse proxy in essence, whereby it will provide access to on-premise resources, applications, SSL servers and RDP hosts without a VPN, but still with the added security. And that added security comes in the form of two-factor authentication, obviously provided by Duo, and there is other additional features that you can leverage with Duo, which we'll take a look at as we get into the demonstration. So essentially it's a VPN-less solution, so you can actually access on-premise resources without the need for a VPN, and that's great. Some benefits of the DNG. I've put a few down here that I could kind of think of from the top of my head here, and the first one is, what we just spoke about there, in that we don't need a VPN in order to access internal resources. So this really helps in reducing the configuration overhead. So for instance, you don't have to have VPN termination points at your corporate office or branch offices, wherever they may be, or even in the DC, to terminate those VPN connections before those users that need access to internal resources actually can access those internal resources. So it's pretty much a feature. It's kind of consolidating, if you like, the VPN requirement and the requirement to access internal resources, in that we're still using, in order to kind of form that connection, we're still using a secure protocol. So we're still using HTTPS in order to kind of establish that connectivity from outbound to the DNG, and then from the DNG we essentially proxy that request to the resource, so that the outside user essentially doesn't connect directly to internal resources. As I mentioned in the previous slide, one good benefit here is that you actually get access to on-premise resources from wherever you are. And I've put there in brackets if permitted, because you can actually develop policies in Duo to control access to those applications based on location as well. And if we get some time in the demonstration, we can also take a look at that as well. Increased return on investment. You don't have to, you're not managing a VPN solution. You're not having to renew that hardware. If it is hardware, you're not having to pay for staff to implement changes on the VPN solution and things like that. So, in essence, you're just managing one solution, which helps to increase that return on investment. And I've pretty much just alluded to it there, less administration, so less configuration required on multiple devices, change control, all the rest of it there. You're literally just having to manage Duo as opposed to a multi-factor authentication solution as well as a VPN solution. It's pretty easy to set up and deploy, and we'll see this when we get into the demonstration of the DNG. We'll take it, we'll go through a number of steps covering a number of different things just to show you how easy it can be to deploy, providing you have planned correctly and follow the prerequisites in order to get things up and running. At Duo, if you haven't checked out our documentation yet, we do have easy to follow documentation, so it's always recommended whenever you're going through any of our documentation to implement protection for applications, do make sure you follow that documentation and check the documentation first and foremost before you actually start. And lastly, the DNG is a lightweight application that's installed in the DMZ, and it runs on Docker containers essentially. So I wanted to get a little bit technical just to kind of show you the inner workings of the DNG and kind of how it's all put together, and what happens in the background essentially. And hopefully you can see the lovely diagram that I put together. So we'll quickly kind of run through the steps here in terms of how the DNG works. So if we just look at the left hand side of the screen there, we've got the two-factor authentication device here. We've got the remote worker. We've got a public DNS. We've got the Duo Cloud. We have the DNG, which is, in this case, duodng.networkwizkid.co.uk. That's a fully qualified domain reachable on the internet for my DNG. And then on our internal DNS, we have that also configured to point to our DNG as well. And then lastly, on the right hand side, we have bob.networkwizkid.com, and this is just an internal PC, and we could pretty much say that this is going to be the RDP client that we connect to here. So providing the DNG is all set up, we start essentially with step 1, and that is where the remote worker initiates an RDP connection to bob.external.networkwizkid.co.uk. So that remote worker wants to access this remote desktop client, and one thing you've probably noticed already is that the fully qualified domain name is different to the internal domain name, and that's totally fine, because our public DNS is going to route that appropriately to our DNG, then on to our RDP instance once the resolution from the DNG is done to our internal DNS. So the name server record for the subdomain external.networkwizkid.co.uk points to the public IP address of the DNG. So this is the duo dng.networkwizkid.co.uk in this instance. So you can already see there really how the NS record is pointing to a public IP address of the DNG. From there then, the DNG checks to see if a valid relay exists and then performs an internal DNS lookup for bob.networkwizkid.com. And excuse me, because I am trying to focus on the little text as well as I'm kind of doing this for you guys as well. So I'm really testing my eyesight at the minute. But yeah, this essentially says in step 3, once we have done the public DNS lookup, which points to the public IP address of the DNG, once that traffic is relayed then to the DNG, in step 3, what we're going to do from a DNG perspective is then perform a lookup on our internal DNS for bob.networkwizkid.com, and that then will essentially return the IP address for that RDP host. So once that's done, the DNG assigns an IP address in the CNAT or carrier grade NAT space for the requested host and sends back the IP address and the TTL for the host name as a DNS-A record. So that's from the DNG back out to the remote worker. And then once that's done, the remote worker then attempts to establish an RDP connection to the provided IP address, which is then routed to the Duo Connect tunnel or the DC TUN. And this is on the Duo Connect is an application which we'll take a little bit more of a look at when we get into the demonstration, and this will probably make more sense as we start to put those pieces together. From there, the DC tunnel queries the Duo Connect TCP proxy, which then contacts the DNG to start the authentication process. The DNG redirects the user to the Duo cloud to complete the two-factor authentication via single sign-on. Once that user's completed that primary authentication, the remote worker enters, I guess that's step 7. So the remote worker enters the SSO primary authentication credentials, which are then checked against the configured identity provider. And we'll take a look at the different sort of identity providers that we can have shortly. And then if the primary credentials are valid, the user is asked to then complete the two-factor authentication as part of what Duo does essentially. Once the user approves the push request from the two-factor authentication device here on the left-hand side, the far left, assuming that that's obviously a legitimate connection request, user approves that, and then Duo Cloud notifies the DNG of a successful secondary authentication, which is that push in this instance. And then from there, the remote worker is allowed to connect then to bob.networkwizkid.com via the configured RDP relay. And we'll take a look at what that means as well as we get into this a little bit deeper. But I just wanted to kind of just show you the inner workings in the background. This is something that I put together a short while ago when I was kind of going through it and understanding the concepts as well. So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense to you as well. So we have some prerequisites, as I mentioned at the start of this video, and we need to make sure that we essentially plan correctly to ensure we have a successful deployment and we minimize any issues that we may run into. So there's a few things here. that I've noted, and a lot of these are also, if not all of them, and then some, are contained in the Duo documentation as well. So do be sure to check out the Duo documentation too. So the first one is to obviously plan for the deployment of the DNG. And we need to, when we're planning for a deployment of the DNG, we need to look at what it is that we actually want to protect. Now, the DNG supports web applications, SSH hosts using port 22, and RDP hosts as well. So we do have a wide array of resources that we can protect, and I do believe other ports can be used. However, do bear in mind that if you do test that, and although you may get something working on ports that are not specified in the Duo documentation, just bear in mind that that's probably likely not even supported yet. So if you run into any issues, you're essentially on your own. Now, in any organization, I would say, regardless of how big or small you are, you need to ask yourself whether you need to consider high availability. This is always an important question, one that shouldn't be overlooked. So what I would say is that if you do want to ensure this service is more than capable of operating, if one instance fails, then do take a further look into the high availability concepts on the Duo documentation. You also need to select your SAML IDP that is going to be used when looking to use a DNG. The recommendation is to use Duo single sign-on. The Duo Access Gateway, if you are used to using Duo and maybe have certain applications protected already, that is going away, so I don't recommend using that, even if you can still use that. But I do believe new accounts won't have the option to use the Duo Access Gateway anymore, which was essentially just an on-prem solution similar to Duo SSO. The only difference is that Duo SSO is obviously hosted in the cloud by us. Other IDPs do exist that you can configure, and again, as we get into the demonstration, we can take a look at some of these. Alternatively, check the documentation. The Duo auth proxy will be needed if you are looking at using an on-premise Active Directory as a primary authentication source. So do bear that in mind. You will have to plan to deploy the authentication proxy and configure the authentication proxy as well. And we might get time to do that in one of the demonstrations, so you can see how that works as well. Deploying the DNG in your DMZ is recommended, ensuring that it is correctly segmented, essentially. But one thing to kind of point out in regards to planning is that when you or before you deploy the DNG, make sure that you have assigned the right resources based on the amount of requests that you intend to be, or the DNG intends to be receiving as well. Again, check out the Duo documentation on the DNG, because there is a lovely table that you can take a look at that will help you spec your machine, and there is also different Linux flavors that are supported as well, with examples as well, so do check that out. And as you probably guessed there, yep, the DNG is deployed on a Linux machine, and it's containerized using Docker. Another thing you will need to prepare for is adding firewall rules. So you need to ensure, again, that you've read the Duo documentation just to make sure that all the ports and protocols are covered. It's pretty straightforward. You essentially need to make sure that the ports and protocols to and from the DNG are permitted. So I believe it's TCP 8443 and DNS if using RDP as well. But again, do check the documentation as things may change. And also ports and protocols from the DNG to internal resources as well. So, you know, as the DNG is working as a kind of reverse proxy, you need to ensure that the DNG can access the intended resources on the ports that have been requested. Allow communication from the internet to the DNG. So as I showed in the demonstration on the lovely diagram that I presented on the last slide, we essentially need to create an FQDN for the DNG and ensure that that is publicly resolvable as well. And we'll take a look at this if we can in the setup we do in the upcoming videos. But yeah, that's just one thing to bear in mind. There is going to need to be some additions added to your public DNS. Depending on your environment, you may need to configure NAT statements as well, or have NAT statements configured prior. All depends on your environment. So I've done a deployment of the DNG, for example, in my home network, and essentially only having one public IP address, I need to NAT the request coming from the public IP address to the DNG, essentially, so that I can get my DNG solution working. It's likely organizations you have more than one IP address. Maybe smaller businesses, startups may only have one, so that is something that I just wanted to point out. Or if you actually want to run this in your own environment like me, then again, that's probably something you will need to consider, and that configuration will vary depending on the sort of setup and devices that you're using as well. So we'll likely not cover that in the demonstration. Lastly, you will need to purchase an SSL certificate for the DNG from a well-known CA, so that it's trusted. This common name can be specific to the DNG FQDN, or you can also create a wildcard certificate, which is less secure as well. If you don't want to purchase a certificate for whatever reason, you can configure one with Let's Encrypt for free, and this will also automatically renew, and that's done at the point of configuring the DNG. So we'll actually get to see how and what that looks like as we go through the demonstration. So general configuration steps, and I've put general configuration steps because you could technically do these in a different order, or they could be some slightly more complex configuration that you want to look at as well. So again, do ensure that you run through the Duo documentation to make sure that your requirements are in place before you actually start to roll this out. But in general, the configuration steps are as follows. So you first really start off by accessing the Duo admin panel to configure Duo for single sign-on, or tying it to any other identity provider as well. As I mentioned before, and I've put this as optional depending on how you're configuring your identity provider, install and configure the Duo auth proxy, and that's if you're using an on-premise Active Directory for that primary authentication. We'll then move on to installing the Linux machine that will be used for the DNG. and then once that Linux machine is up and running, we'll then look at installing Docker and Docker Compose to allow the DNG to run in a containerized environment. Once that's done, we'll install the DNG and verify its installation. There's two different options that do exist and are shown on the Duo documentation. So do check them out. I believe one is for SSH and web applications, and then the other one is for SSH web applications and RDP as well. Once you've done that, configure the DNG with its initial configuration and authentication sources so that we can get that up and running. And then once we've done that, we can then start to look at protecting the applications and resources that you initially wanted to protect as well. And then lastly, once we've done that, we install and configure the Duo Connect client on the host that where it's required, and then we can test access then to those resources by using the DNG, because everything should be up and running by then. So that's it in a nutshell. I've put on the useful links where you can follow me, my YouTube, my website, Twitter, and I've also included the link to the Duo documentation around the DNG. So again, do check that out. I hope you found this video useful, looking at the prerequisites for the DNG, and I hope this allows and helps you to plan for your upcoming deployment of the DNG. In the upcoming videos, we're going to look at each of the resources that we can protect. So we'll look at protecting web applications, we'll look at protecting SSH servers, we'll look at protecting RDP clients as well. And we'll run through demonstrations for each one of those. So if you found this video useful, do please like, subscribe, give me a thanks if you like, and hit that notifications bell if you want to be notified of the upcoming videos that I upload as well.